Good afternoon and happy Saturday, everyone. I'm your host, the Dramatic Historian, and today we have a very special guest, Harold Holzer. He is the author of over 56 books, both published and edited. He specializes in the life of Abraham Lincoln. He's the chairman of the Lincoln Forum and a recipient of the National Humanities Medal. He's the director of the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College in New York. But today we're going to be discussing brought forth on this continent his most recent book about Abraham Lincoln's immigration, or his views on immigration as along with his policy. So this is going to open up a series of conversations along with possibly political conversations. So let's go ahead and get into it. Harold, thanks so much for coming on today. I really appreciate that.
Great to be with you.
I must say that your book, I thought a lot about hypocrisies between both the Whig Party and the Democratic Party at the time. A lot of that just didn't make any sense to me. I thought a lot about my own political views as I was reading this book. And I feel like it's very, very relevant to today's culture, especially in terms of immigration. That's a very hot topic right now. And in fact, I want to start off with a quote from a far right political commentator who he has a very large following of young men that listen to him. He recently said in 2021, he said that the founders never intended for America to be a refugee camp for non-white people. Now, he never explains what non-white is. If you look at the context of what he's actually talking about, you'll notice that he actually incorporates Jewish people included as non-white. And your book starts off by talking about the founding of this country and how accurate is it that he makes this statement in terms of how our founders viewed immigration and the policies in the early republic.
Wow, that's a big first question. Look, the founders, as brilliant and prescient as they were, didn't anticipate a lot of things. They didn't anticipate that the right to bear arms would include submachine guns either, because there were no submachine guns. They didn't anticipate, so in a sense, the commentator is right, that we would become a place of refuge for non-English speaking, non-English rooted people. But I think the founders did expect the United States, the new United States, to be a refuge, maybe for a very practical reason at the beginning. And the practical reason was that we were a vast new country. We immediately looked westward from the founding colonies and looked, if not quite yet to manifest destiny, at least to an expansion westward. We know that George Washington had that on his mind from the beginning of the revolution. So I think he's quite wrong that there was no interest in filling this land with people. We couldn't do it by reproducing ourselves, although, we had enslaved people who were going to outnumber white people anyway, if left, if encouraged to have families that could become enslaved. So I think the founders pretty quickly realized it, certainly in the Adams generation. Adams reacted badly, Jefferson reacted better to the idea of immigrants. Immigrants of color probably were not thought of until after the Civil War, but neither were liberties for people of color who were born here. So again, it's a little hard to go back to 250 years to layer our current problems on the founders. But I do think they were looking to populate the country with people who came from overseas.
How did the Federalists view immigration versus the Democratic Party later on?
Well, it's interesting. Through the Civil War, political parties regarded immigrants with either sympathetically or unsympathetically, based at least in part on the likely political affiliation of the new immigrants. And why that was important is, unlike today, when refugees and immigrants languish in this no man's land and no woman's land for decades, really decades and decades, with all sorts of elaborate work permits and green cards and other things. The original contemplation of transferring to America was that you came here on a boat, you got off the boat, you registered at a registry, and 5 years later, 5 years, you were, if you went back and signed your oath, you were a citizen of the United States with the right to vote. 5 years. Now, the difference between the Federalists and the Democrats at the beginning was that some of the Federalists wanted to increase that to 14 years, maybe 21 years. The reason being that the initial immigrants turned out to be Catholics who were more likely to affiliate with the Democratic Republicans than with the Federalists. So the Federalists put up impediments because the new arrivals were likely to outnumber them in at the polls.
So then, where does Lincoln fit into this narrative? Because it seems that
Yeah,
he evolved his views of immigration certainly evolved over
yeah.
time, as you mentioned throughout the book.
Could I set the stage a little bit for Lincoln first?
Of
Because
course.
before, about 10 years before he was born, John Adams did pass an Alien Act, usually compartmentalized with the Sedition Act into one big, beautiful bill, even then. And that limited immigration. But Jefferson let it sunset. So it was kind of open borders, truly open borders that we shudder from. What changed was the circumstances in Europe in the 1840s. First, the potato famine, which starved the Irish out of their homeland and persuaded many of them to emigrate to the United States because they had no hope of making a living agriculturally with this terrible disease that had afflicted the crops for more than 1 year. Suddenly, an influx of Irish Catholics. At the same time, there were political revolutions on the continent that failed in 1848, or just a few years later. And all of a sudden, you got all these liberal anti-slavery people, mostly Germans, moving to the United States as well. So although there was a lot of support to open the doors again after the Alien Acts had sunset, no one expected 5 million immigrants in one decade. That was a huge number. And that's when nativism took hold in the United States. That was really the first time that there was an anti-immigrant movement, anti-immigrant candidates for office, for local, and even by 1856 for president, running openly on the quote American Party. So this is the world that Lincoln enters in his early days in politics. And his coming of age came in 1844 when there was an anti-Irish riot in Philadelphia, blamed largely on Whigs who were inhospitable to Catholic immigrants. It all started when the Irish neighborhoods asked if they could use the Catholic Bible for the mandatory daily prayers in public schools. So that was an issue back, 180 years ago as well. There was a riot. There was, destruction of churches and libraries. And the Whigs quickly went on the defensive to try to paint themselves as not responsible for anti-Catholicism or anti-Catholic hatred. So Lincoln got involved all the way out in Springfield, Illinois, drafting his first comments on immigration, in which he says that nothing should be thrown in the way of immigration. And that's the first time he's on record. Now, he stays a Whig for 10 more years. And the Whigs have very mixed feelings about immigration. Again, because all of the Irish who come in are being welcomed with open arms by Democrats in the big cities. and being embraced by the Democratic Party. So the more the Whigs open their arms to immigration or tolerate immigration, which is about the best they did, the the more votes that are being welcomed into the country that are liable and likely to make their party obsolete, which in fact it became. So, how do I describe Lincoln in the beginning? He's cautiously pro immigration. Does he like Irishmen? Not particularly. Um, he doesn't like them because they're Democrats. I mean, he wouldn't mind Irish Republicans if there are any Republicans there, but there aren't. He likes German immigrants because they vote Republican. Well, they vote Whig and then they vote Republican because they're inclined to anti-slavery. So his his views evolve a little bit according to political expediency, although he never says that immigrants are unwelcome. So that brings us to about 1854. I don't know how much you want me or Lincoln to evolve before you come in with another question, but
Well, I was only just going to briefly mention that the Nativist Party that you brought up before, for our listeners that don't know, just to explain how popular this party became, it was an extent, and correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is that it was an extension of the Whigs, at least one part of it, and that's what
I
made
would say
it
it was a
so.
breakaway party because in 1856, um, the Whigs are gone. The Republicans have their first presidential candidate, not Lincoln, John C. Fremont. But the nativists create their own third party, and it does really, really well. It's probably the third biggest third party movement in American history, behind Theodore Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party and I don't know, Ross Perot, if any of your listeners and viewers remember Ross Perot. Um, so it's a big movement, and it's called the Know Nothing movement, as many of your participants will know, because it was kind of a secret group. And if you knocked on the door and said, "What's going on in there? It sounds like fun. Is this a club I can join?" They would say, "We know nothing, so
Yeah.
back off." And that's how the name got popularized as the Know Nothing Party.
Well, Ulysses S. Grant attended a Know Nothing meetings they had.
He did attend a meeting and decided he didn't like it.
Yep. And
He also owned a slave, so people do evolve. Lincoln was accused in 1860 when he ran for president of having visited a Know Nothing lodge. Now, what city is it? Quincy, Illinois. Um, and he was very unhappy and got people in Quincy to testify to the fact that he never knew where it was, he never went there, he never visited, he never passed by, he never heard of it, blah blah blah. So it was a little bit like going to a speakeasy in Prohibition, but worse. I was going to say
didn't
something else, but I kept it very high toned.
didn't Mary Todd Lincoln get Abraham in trouble a little bit with another Irish politician at one
Oh,
point?
that's yeah. Mary didn't like the Irish very much. She had Irish servants in the house. When the Irish landed in Boston, New York, Philly, they if there were single women and they didn't have a fiance or husband or parents, they were very often put into this system of almost indenture. They were sent west to become servants in well-to-do people's homes. And Mary had kind of a revolving door of Irish cleaning women, and she was abusive, supposedly verbally and in some cases physically. So she didn't, she wasn't crazy about them. Okay, I'm glad you brought up the other story because it's such a great story. I'm trying to be somewhat succinct, but I also have to drag it out so we get to a real punchline. So Mary and Abraham had broken up. They were supposed to get married on January 1st, 1841. Either they broke up or Lincoln actually stood her up at the altar. There are several versions of this story. And obviously, there was a very unhappy period. Lincoln was really unhappy. Some people even said suicidal because he had hurt her. And she was kind of she was in her 20s by then. Shocking not to be married um, by then. Um, and she held out for him. She waited and waited and waited. And they used to court in Mary's sister's home, but Abraham was no longer welcome there because he had jilted Mary. So they used to meet in the offices of the Whig newspaper editor. And there one day, Lincoln found Mary working, on an article which was a satire directed at a Democratic Irish state politician. And Mary and Abe very cleverly said, well, this is a way back into her good graces, maybe even into her heart. I will help her and make it even more ascetic and pungent, because Lincoln could be a very satirical guy in his early days. And they wrote this article, and the aggrieved party, whose name, James Shields, I was drawing a blank, drawing out the story even more before I could have my senior moment and remember his name. James Shields demanded to know the author, and Lincoln manfully, or manned up, that's the expression, right? He manned up and said, it was I wrote it, left Mary out. Shields demanded an apology. Lincoln wrote a very legalistic reply, and Shields challenged him to a duel. They went out to Bloody Island technically in your state. It was in Missouri, where dueling was still legal. And Lincoln, as the challenged party, got the choice of weapons, and he picked broadswords. And then with his long arms, practiced by shearing off the branches of trees. At which point, finally, James Shields said, maybe we should just shake hands and let bygones be bygones. Lincoln was not amused by this. He thought this was about the most embarrassing episode of his life. And on the two occasions we know that it was brought up decades later in the White House, Lincoln would tell the gossip, if you ever want to come back here again, don't ever mention this in my presence. So he was very embarrassed about it. But happy ending, November 1st, 1842, after a long, separation of 22 months, Abraham and Mary Lincoln were married in Springfield.
Well, and happy ending as it is, very
Well,
long.
maybe it wasn't a happy ending for both of them. But the jury is out. There's a new book about Mary that delves very deeply into her troubled life. I don't think either of them was destined ever to be happy. They just
Did
weren't happy people.
did Mary's views ever change on?
Um,
I don't know if you went that far within your research,
yeah,
but I'm
I
just
did.
curious
I
if you
did.
came up.
Because Lincoln gets, again, the Irish don't support him in 1858 when he runs for Senate. They don't support him in 1860 when he runs for president. He brings an African American body servant with him to Washington. Lo and behold, the Irish have control of the lower, below stairs, as we say in Downton Abbey land, and they wouldn't let a black person join the staff. So Mary had to deal with the Irish doorkeepers and doormen, and she had quite a tempestuous relationship with them. And I found that she fired a few of them, and Lincoln never countermanded her dismissals. She developed kind of her own staff, including a black woman, Elizabeth Keckley, who was her seamstress and confidant and stylist, as we would call her today. So yeah, Mary never quite got over her lingering dislike of the Irish. And that's because she didn't like anybody who didn't like her husband.
That I have read about quite a
Yeah.
bit. Going off of that tone, one of the things that just never really made much sense to me, and I don't know the best way that you could even explain this, but was the hypocrisy between these two different political parties. I mean, even Lincoln aside, you have Whigs that are intolerant to immigrants,
Hmm.
while the Democratic Party is very welcoming toward them.
Right.
And then you have the issue of slavery. with Whigs, I understand that some Whigs were more, they supported more civil rights than others. I know that varies, but
Right.
they were more tolerant of getting rid of it or abolishing it, while the Democratic Party was in favor of its expansion and preservation. How do you explain these two ideas?
I mean, the hypocrisy goes so deep. Um, the Whigs, for example, are the party of internal improvements, what we today call infrastructure, right? They championed road construction, bridge construction, canal construction. And then who is going to do the work? Guess who? The Irish. It's like today, people complain about food prices being low, being high. God, I said low. Can you imagine? Being high. Um, Maybe that's because the immigrants who used to be seasonal workers and picking crops have been frightened to death about coming to this country, even for a few months a year. So, of course, less gets harvested and less gets shipped, and our prices are higher. And the people who are suffering are the people who are anti immigration. Same thing. Lincoln and other Illinois Democrats couldn't understand why there are so many Irishmen turning up to cast votes in local elections. Well, that's because they were doing the infrastructure work that the Whig Party supported without thinking of who was actually going to do the building. So that's at one level of hypocrisy. The Democrats, they want free white people, even foreigners, to have opportunities here, but they dehumanize people of color, to be sure. So that's a bigger hypocrisy. And then the most complex hypocrisy of all, if I can put it that way, is the new Republican Party. So, as a brand new party, they have to draw membership and support from all quarters. They want all the old Whigs, right? Those who are pro immigration and anti immigration. They want Democrats who don't favor slavery extension, so Northern Democrats. And they want abolitionists who favor equality now. How do you meld that into one big party under one tent? That was the challenge. So even as late as excuse me 1860, Lincoln is still talking about tolerating former Know Nothing members in the new Republican Party. Is that hypocritical or is it really smart politics? I guess you know, we can say a little of both.
Okay, so then we can get into that. Well, was that evolution then? Is his views going to evolve as a result of moral, political, or strategic circumstances?
Um, that's a great way to put it. And I would say, a third, a third, and a third. Um, Morally, he thinks America should be open to free whites, right? Free white people. Politically, he wants a lot of Germans here to vote, especially as 1860 approaches, and he knows that Illinois is yet to vote for the new Republican Party. He needs Illinois, he needs Indiana, where a lot of Germans live. Ohio, there's a German vote in Cincinnati, etc. And what was the third of your triad there? Moral, political, and there was one more good one.
Strategic.
Strategic. He's looking ahead. How do you create an anti-slavery majority in this country? You do it by winning elections. You do it by making Germans part of your coalition. But you also have to win. So you have to not turn off Northern Democrats and not turn off former Know Nothings. In the 1860 convention in Chicago, Lincoln wins on the third ballot and everything, and Seward is defeated. New York Senator Seward, because he's too anti-slavery. That's the line that historians have been not only buying but selling for 160 years. I don't believe that's true. Lincoln was just as anti-slavery as Seward. He was less experienced, so he's more like Graham Plattner than he is like Sherrod Brown. He's not that much on record. Lincoln didn't have a Twitter record or tattoos, so he didn't have as many drawbacks. But Seward's real problem, I think, was that he was a big pro immigration man in New York. He had always been for state aid to parochial schools. He was friendly with the highest ranking member of the Catholic Church in the United States, Bishop John Hughes. And I think a lot of know nothings deserted him for Lincoln because of that, not because of anti slavery. And I think that's overlooked because by then Lincoln has done this in balancing act of being anti slavery, being tolerant of know nothings, but also endorsing the new Republican plank pushed in by the Germans that reiterated immigration rights and their access to citizenship. So Lincoln was an ideologue, but he was also a very, very smart politician. And I'll say one more thing, if I may.
Mhm.
Um, no less an observer than Karl Marx, that's probably an unexpected reference point, wrote after seeing the Emancipation Proclamation that he'd never seen anyone quite like Abraham Lincoln as a writer because he would take ordinary things and make them extraordinary. But when he was dealing with extraordinary matters, he would tone it down and not use great eloquence. The Emancipation Proclamation was written in very legalistic prose because Lincoln knew he had to sell it, and it was going to be hard to sell it as a philanthropic gesture. It had to be sold as a war measure. Similarly, when he's president and a candidate for president, he wants immigration, particularly after the Civil War starts, but he's going to have to base his support, which now becomes very public, for immigration rights on what America needs to survive, not on his affection for Germans.
When when I was in New York City not too long ago, I went to Grant's Tomb for the first time.
Okay,
And one of the things that I was not expecting to see was off in one of the side rooms, there is a series of flags in this room. And I was looking at the names of the regiments who carried these flags, and I come across one of them, the Mozart Regiment. And I might be getting a little far ahead here, but did Lincoln already foresee the need to use or recruit immigrants into the military during the Civil War? Because it's not just the Mozart Regiment.
no,
You in your
not at
book
all.
mentioned the Garibaldi Regiment. There were several other Germans that participated. One in particular was a supporter of Marx. So just going back to your Marx
Right,
reference. But
and the Irish Brigade and all the Irish
yeah,
brigades,
yeah.
Hungarian,
So if you just want to
French.
speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, when does the light bulb go off? I mean, Lincoln, after his election, convinces himself that secession is not going to be a serious threat, that the passions will die down in the slave states and that the Union will be preserved and they can talk through a compromise. When does he realize? I mean, he realizes that as the Sumter crisis hits, that he's going to have to call for 75,000 volunteers, and that as a result of that, in a domino effect, that more states are going to secede and that there's really going to be a rebellion. So I would say a week after Fort Sumter, he and Seward and the aforementioned Archbishop Hughes, he got promotion, um, come up with lists of Irishmen that they would trust to lead units to support the Union. And Nathan, I don't know if you visited Union Square when you came to New York. If you haven't, you should, because there is a giant equestrian statue of George Washington there. And it actually was only the second equestrian statue in the United States, supposedly. The first one, in my other role, I'm the new Manhattan borough historian. I'll explain that later if you want to hear the explanation. But there was a statue of King George III, which the Patriots on July 9th, 1776, tore down and smashed into pieces to make bullets. So this giant statue, of Washington. This was the central focus of a rally that took place just 5 days after Fort Sumter, and as many as 150,000 New Yorkers. That's more than the Knicks parade if you add, the multipliers of birth since 1861, thronged Union Square to voice their support for recruitment and fighting the rebellion, and also repaying the insult to the American flag that had been suffered at Sumter. And the Irish were there. The Irish pledged allegiance, and the Germans had separate speakers. So Lincoln immediately created a memo where he listed 3 Irish military people that he thought would be recruiting magnets to get volunteers, whether they were Democrats, or not, to join up this kind of holy battle to save the Union. And guess who was on the list? James Shields, the guy who he'd fought a duel with. Michael Corcoran, who had only a few months before been court-martialed for refusing to call his Irish regiment out to greet the Prince of Wales in New York City. He said, "Why would I allow my troops to greet someone who's oppressing my home country?" And then Franz Sigel, a German in Missouri, was one of those. Carl Schurz, all of these people started recruiting ethnic regiments. They weren't always successful, but Lincoln had to prove the diversity of the Union right away, and he also had to prove that the war was not going to be a Republican war or exclusively a Republican war. And so he definitely depended on Irish Democrats to fight in the Union's behalf. And that took a big effort.
I remember seeing a statue of George Washington when I was there, but I don't think I personally went to go visit it. But I plan on coming out again next year, so maybe then I'll go see it. Now, there's a lot that you had mentioned there that one of them being Carl Schurz. I talk about someone who is truly dedicated to this cause, because was he not just appointed as an ambassador to, I believe it was Spain?
It was, yeah.
I mean, talk about it.
He wanted Mexico, but he didn't get it.
Yeah.
It's so political. Schurz had been and by the way, I don't know exactly how to pronounce it. I had a friend named Hans Trefus, who was a German-born Lincoln scholar. He said Schurz, but I'm not ready to do that because no one will know who I'm talking about. And the mayor's residence in New York City is located in Carl Schurz Park, which is the way you said it. So I'm going to go halfway and say shirts, like shirts that we wear. Yeah, he was a Seward man, but Seward turned on him for some reason. He thought that since he was a revolutionary, he should not be a European ambassador from the United States, that he would upset the royal courts whose support the Union needed. Talk about a strategic thinker. Seward was a strategic thinker. So Schurz originally raised regiments in New York City, or tried to. The problem is he had dawdled a bit waiting for his diplomatic appointment, and all the Germans were kind of signed up. So he did go to Spain for a year. He bought all the regalia, the fancy, like semi-toreador outfit that to be presented to the king, and a sword. And then he just couldn't stand it. And he came back in 1862 and indeed got a regiment of his own. Fought less than distinguished way in Chancellorsville. The Germans got a very tough and bad rap for that, but then redeemed himself at Gettysburg, especially in comparison with his fellow German Alexander Schimmelpfennig, whom Lincoln had recruited because he liked the sound of his name. He thought, as he put it, the Dutch will love Schimmelpfennig. The Dutch was what Lincoln and others called the Germans. It was kind of a bastardization of the word Deutsche. It became Dutch. Anyway, Schimmelpfennig, you probably know the story. Schimmelpfennig retreated after the first day's fighting at Gettysburg and saw a townhouse on the main drag and hid in the pigsty for the next 2 days. And I actually have visited that house, and a friend of mine who is a great Lincoln artist named Wendy Allen lives in the little house next door. Still, both original to the battle. And Carl Schurz is back in town after the third day of fighting, and suddenly he sees Schimmelpfennig and says, "Alex, we all thought you were dead. Where were you?" And he said, "Oh, I was in the pigsty back of that house. The food's not very good. What they give pigs shouldn't be given to a pig." I made that part up, and
Yeah,
he was still complaining.
you
So
know,
Lincoln,
my
I don't know which of these original um, recruiting magnates were successful. Sigel was known as a great hero. I fight Smith Sigel was a rallying cry, but then he retreated so often they started calling him the Flying Dutchman, which was not a very nice nickname. Corcoran was captured at Bull Run. He spent a year in a prison camp. His successor didn't do well. Shields was a failure. Grant hated Shields. He could not wait to get him out of the service. And the rap on the Irish guys was that they drank too much. My favorite ethnic officer is the guy who started the Garibaldi regiment. Do you know about him?
the Hungarian.
The Hungarian, who called himself Frederick Dutasi, but whose real name was David Strasser. He was a convicted horse thief from Hungary. And, when he went into the army, apparently he was a fairly good officer, but you can't, it's like the famous bank robber Willie Sutton. If he saw money, he stole it. He just couldn't help himself. And what is the worst place you can put a horse thief? How about the army, which has more horses than it knows well? Well, in the case of the Union Army, they needed horses. So Strasser started doing business in horseflesh, and he was eventually drummed out of the service and finished the war in Sing Sing prison, protesting to the end that he was an innocent hero. So, what the recruitment did is not produce great heroes, the early recruitment. The only one I can think of is Sheridan, who Lincoln called my little Irishman. But he sort of came up through the ranks rather than started a politically or ethnically driven regiment.
You do have some other officers out west, whether that's Peter Osterhaus.
Yeah,
He did relatively well. You have August Village he also was out west, and he was the Marxist. He was the guy that started the
right.
Marxist newspaper.
I know.
But you do have a few, good officers there. But I do think what's fascinating, and you mentioned this in your book, is that the Garibaldi Regiment is named after Giuseppe Garibaldi, who was a very famous. I don't even really know how to classify him. An Italian revolutionary, I
Yeah,
think. Probably.
revolutionary and an Italian unionist in a funny way, right?
Yeah.
He wanted there
Yes.
to be a greater Italy.
Yes. And Lincoln reached out to him about taking command in the Union Army, and he said to an extent, right, that he wants assurances that slavery would be completely abolished, because he himself described himself as a European socialist, and so he wanted that guarantee. But at this point, he's older and he's still focused on Italy.
Yeah, he is pretty old at that. I mean, not what we would call old today, but he was, I think,
Right.
in his 60s.
Right.
And there is dispute. The great romantic story about Garibaldi being offered the command. I think that was the imaginings of a diplomat who rushed down to Sicily or wherever he was to make this grand offer, which he was not authorized to do. I think they wanted Garibaldi to raise a regiment, not the whole army. And Garibaldi, through more than one impediment in the plan, he not only demanded that slavery be abolished a little earlier than Lincoln was willing to agree to, and of course Lincoln was also not willing to give anybody else credit for it because there were other opportunities to give Fremont credit or others, and he wouldn't do that. Um, but Garibaldi also demanded to earn more money than the president. So that was a non starter. So I think he talked his way out of an American assignment, even if we can imagine that he was really capable of undertaking it. I
Yeah,
think he had been here, so he knew the country.
he did. I think he liked to exaggerate his exploits just a little bit.
Yep,
That wasn't completely uncommon with a lot of revolutionaries, but hey, I mean, at least he wasn't a horse thief.
he was
So
not
there,
overseas. Well, Schertz also claimed to have a very kind of romantic, kind of swashbuckling career as a revolutionary in Germany, hiding out here and getting rescued there and fleeing to England and, getting his fiance and rushing off to America. So, yeah, I think the story's got a little more exaggerated. These were very heroic guys, and they were all fighting against monarchies and dictatorships. And
yeah, and I'm gonna backtrack a little bit here.
sure,
One of the questions that I'm really kind of curious about, we had briefly touched on the Emancipation Proclamation, and how closely do you think Lincoln's development on immigration paralleled with his evolution on emancipation and black citizenship?
well, black citizenship doesn't come into play until 3 days before he was assassinated.
Right.
So I don't
Yeah.
think he contemplates black citizenship. I think he has one overriding rationale or excuse to pursue this expansion of our concept of what it means to be an American or what it means to be free. And that was, um, you know, we take for granted today the idea that the North, one of the reasons the North won the war was that it had more men. And, it would not have had more men if Lincoln had not, signed the bill in March 1863 to recruit blacks into the army. And what was the end result? 200,000 extra people in the army who were really fighting ferociously for their own freedom and for the freedom of their families. That was the way Lincoln presented it to the public was we're denying home front labor to the rebel states. And then he adds, and we can recruit blacks. Of course, we'll pay them less because they're black. But then later he agrees to, with Frederick Douglass, he'll increase the pay and give them pay parity. So Lincoln always saw this as evolutionary. But the army is still getting depleted. Think about it. If we credit 750,000, if we acknowledge 750,000 deaths in the Civil War, maybe 450,000 of them on the northern side, that's a lot of soldiers. The draft has begun. It's not going that well, or it's about to begin by the time Lincoln recruits black troops. So the draft is underway in the spring of 1863. But there are so many deaths and so many casualty reports after Chancellorsville and Gettysburg and the Western Theater, and then at the beginning of 1864, the Overland Campaign, which is the most bloody of all. Lincoln doesn't know where he's going to get troops from. And one way to recruit is to recruit from overseas because there are people who want to come in. So Lincoln in December 63, just 11 months after the Emancipation comes in, just 9 months after black recruitment is enacted, he proposes an immigration reform to relax any lingering restrictions. He calls it an act to encourage immigration. And and he says specifically to work in the fields, in the mines, and in the factories, because they can always join ethnic regiments, but also the depletion of young manpower in rural and urban domestic pursuits and civilian operations is so widespread. If we acknowledge about 450,000 deaths for the total war, how many tens and thousands of others were amputees or otherwise injured or suffering from PTSD or whatever it was called in 1863 and 4. So this was a revolutionary act. Lincoln always wanted new immigrants, but this was a way to make it palatable to people who still had mixed feelings about welcoming foreigners. Lincoln even hinted that he wanted the federal government to pay for the ocean passage of prospective immigrants, which was a bridge too far, no pun intended, even to Republicans. So they turned that down.
Well, the entire time as you were kind of talking about that, I was thinking of two things. The first being that, I find just the one thing that continues to impress me about Lincoln is that his entire political career, it just seems like he keeps trying to create a tent that's bigger and bigger. He tries to
Right.
encompass just about everybody. And even in this particular instance, I feel like that there's some of that going on. Now, how much of that, is moral, political, strategic, I don't know. But um, I still find that really admirable because the second thing that I was thinking about was, I keep reading about the Russia-Ukraine war, and I think a lot about the soldiers that Putin keeps calling up because they're losing so many Russian soldiers. And it seems to me that the soldiers that he's recruiting are from, Asia and places that are not
Korea. Yeah.
European Russian. And so I find this very interesting and unique and something that, I don't think Putin could ever wrap his head around in terms of uh, how to properly recruit soldiers and what they're actually fighting for. So that was kind of the second thing that I was
Yeah.
thinking about.
Well,
So then,
Lincoln is always a great salesman for recruitment, and you can see that in 1864, just few months after he signs the immigration reform, which he does, by the way, on July 4th, 1864. And I think he picked that date on purpose because remember at Gettysburg, he talked about a more perfect union. He talked about what it meant to, again, expand the promise of government of by and for the people. So I think you're hitting it right on about what he's seeing the future to be. On a July 4th, 6 years earlier, well, a couple of days after July 4th, he had addressed a Chicago audience um, celebrating American independence. And he said, I look out at this audience and I see the actual descendants of people who fought in the Revolutionary War. But I also see among you Irishmen and Scandinavians and Germans. And I want you to know that in my view, you have as much right as the bloodline of the defenders, of the founders, to enjoy the rights under the Declaration of Independence. Um, your blood of the founders. He never said that was poisoning the blood. He said it was blood of the blood. And that was a moral belief. But again, he has to sell everything politically. And he has to get a consensus. He already has half of the country um, not voting at all. He's got to get more than half of the remaining half to support the war. And that's going to be very hard. And he's always conscious of the fact that he can't get ahead of where he worries the voters are.
I always have to somewhat almost laugh at this idea of the bloodline of our founders because
Yeah.
you know it even talking to Swedes or whoever, it's like, well, maybe it's like British, right? But the fact of the matter is you had so many different groups coming into the new world that
Yeah.
it's hard for me to essentially look at the founders being different than those of Swedish people or whatever that may be. But
Listen, think of how many recent presidents are just a couple of generations away from immigrants. Maybe not the Bushes because they are, go back to the Mayflower, I think, or some of them. But uh, John Kennedy's grandfather was born in Ireland. Um, Donald Trump's grandfather was born in Ireland, the biggest naysayer about immigration that we have. Stephen Miller's grandfather was born in Europe. So, you know, um, you once you open the door Lincoln believed you shouldn't close the door behind you. And that was the
Do,
moral part of his argument.
do you think that Lincoln was ahead of his time on immigration policy? Um, or do you think it reflected broader changes happening within the Republican Party, or was it maybe it was a little bit of both?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think he was in his time. Part of the country ardently believed in opening the doors. You know, during the war, a few more states came in. I mean, Kansas comes in at the beginning of the war, and they've got the western states, and Nevada comes in 1864, and in time for the election. No coincidence. Um, these are regions that have to be filled up. Otherwise, heaven forbid, Native people would be in charge. So, um, you know, Lincoln wants European immigration. I don't think he conjures up the idea of Latino immigration. I just don't think it's on his radar or what passed for 19th century radar. We also know that he signed what was regrettably called a Cooley Act, restricting Chinese immigration in the 60s. And he did that for, he said, both political and moral reasons. They didn't admit to the political. But the political is that California Republicans told them, we don't want any more Asians coming in. The gold rush is over. You have to put a stop to it. And the moral reason is that Lincoln thought that these ships that were crowded with Chinese immigrants in inhuman conditions was akin to reviving the slave trade. And he didn't want to do that because when these immigrants got to the West Coast, they were practically enslaved. So that was his explanation. Would he have come around? Probably, because he's leading the vanguard in what we think is very modest ways, but there was plenty of pushback. And remember, Lincoln signs one more bill in 1865 to kind of refine the 1864 bill. And it is 100 years until another pro-immigration bill is signed. And that's Lyndon Johnson's bill, getting rid of quota systems and opening the doors to Southeast Asian immigrants, particularly who had staked their lives on American success in the Vietnam era. It took 100 years, in between which there was the Chinese Immigration Act. There was the 1924 bills that try to stop Italians and Jews and Poles and Greeks from coming in because they weren't as clean immigration-wise as the Northern Europeans, who of course were opposed as well. So the pushback, regrettably, is what has dominated our culture in the last century.
Well, and even Ulysses S. Grant, I believe he restricted Chinese
He
immigration
did.
to the United States as well.
And then he goes on a worldwide trip and he comes back again with his eyes open. Lincoln had to do this without. Lincoln had to broaden his horizons just based on the foreign born people he met. He never set foot outside the United States except to go to Niagara Falls, Canada.
Well, and even in Grant's words, Lincoln was the greatest man he ever met. So I think in that instance, especially whether it's on immigration or not, I mean, Lincoln certainly had the foresight to see this and know what needed to be done. So in terms of overall research of this book, I always really like asking this question. Was there any story that you found in your research that just really stood out to you and you're like, I have to incorporate this?
Well, I guess on the story on the negative side was certainly Dutasi, who we talked about a while ago because of the comical nature of his activities. I think one immigrant who I think shows Lincoln in all of his is the best of Lincoln is his barber, whose name was William de Fleurville, later anglicized to Billy Flourville. He was a Haitian immigrant, Creole, probably spoke with a French patois or accent, and Lincoln was his regular customer. He worked right near Lincoln's law office. There's a marker in Springfield today that identifies the site of Billy's barber's office. And he even represented Flourville in several legal cases, treating him as a citizen. And Flourville's own son was re-enslaved, I believe, in New Orleans, and Lincoln represented him in an effort to get him liberated. But what I love about this relationship is, I mean, considering that Lincoln really left all of his Springfield world behind him, as he left his New Salem world behind him when he went to Springfield, he was not nostalgic about old friends, interestingly. He was just, he stepped up to the next rung of the ladder and left his memories and his acquaintances behind. And they complained about it, that he didn't remember them as, generously as he should have. But Flourville writes him a letter in, I think, 63, in which he says, I think you might like to know that your house is looking good. He rented it. Help, I rented my house. What's going to happen? And your dog Fido is doing well. That's something he could tell the boys, because Willie and Tad were very unhappy that their parents did not allow them to take their beloved dog to Washington. They got plenty of pets in the White House, but Lincoln was not a dog lover. I'll say that on the side. He was a cat person. So, which is kind of weird to think about. But so Flourville writes this letter, and I'm looking at all of the letters that Lincoln got from Springfield during his presidency. You're being too nice to one person. You're not being nice enough to me. I want a job. I want a military job. I want a judgeship. I want this. I want to be a postmaster. Flourville didn't ask for anything. He was an immigrant who had struggled, whose own son had nearly lost his freedom, who probably had a really rough time establishing a small business in Lincoln, Springfield, and who was kind and generous and thoughtful enough to just give Lincoln an update without asking for anything. If I was Flourville, I would have said, could you please send me a lock of hair? Because I know that's going to be really valuable someday. And it's the least you could do. I cut that damn hair for years, and it's hard to get a comb through. He didn't even ask for that.
He just should have pocketed some that he got off the
I
floor,
know, right?
or something like that. And then, obviously that'd be on an
There's
episode of
really
Pawn
too much
Stars
hair
later.
around. It's enough to fill 10 mattresses, so I don't think all of it is authentic. But we don't have Lincoln's DNA to compare it to. We could have, but that's another story. We don't.
If Lincoln were alive today, and I know these questions are,
Yeah,
sometimes
he'd be
people like,
very, very, very old.
yeah, if he were alive today,
Right.
and he saw these arguments taking place over immigration, number one, would he be surprised at all, or what arguments do you think he could probably connect with the most?
I think he would probably not be surprised. I think he would be disappointed that so many barriers have been erected to prevent people seeking refuge from coming into this country that is not founded on blood, not even founded on land. It's founded on the idea of opportunity and refuge. Emma Lazarus was right on when she wrote about the poor, the tired, the wretched, yearning to breathe free, and our obligation to shelter them and to give them opportunity. He would say, look at the last 150 years. My prognosis proved right. Immigrants have enriched the country, and they should be considered blood of the blood, and we should take a chance on people, even if they seem alien to us. That is the American idea, not restrictions.
Well, again, we are here today with Harold Holzer. You can pick up his book at Amazon or at Penguin Books, but thank you again for coming on. I really do appreciate it.
Nathan, I've enjoyed it. It's great talking to you. And remember, you have to come back to New York and see not only Civil War sites, but you mentioned that I work at Roosevelt House. That's Franklin D. Roosevelt's home, and it's the place where the New Deal was actually born.
Well, I will make sure to come over there, and hopefully you could give me a tour. I don't know.
I will. If I'm still there, you're on.
No, I like I said, I plan on trying to get out there next year.
Good.
And also for my listeners, don't forget, when you have a fix for history, go sign up for History Fix, where you can have access to hundreds of videos ranging from the American Revolution to World War II. Check it out now at historyfix.com. I'm the dramatic historian, and we will see you all on another Saturday.